probably the modern human lineage leading to the great majority of the ancestors of people today was in sub-Saharan Africa. But in a period between about 2 million to 500,000 years ago, I think throughout many parts of Eurasia and throughout many parts of Africa, with a parallel increase in brain size and not obviously closer ancestrality to modern humans.
For over half a century, we've been told with remarkable confidence that modern humans evolved in Africa and spread across the world from there. This narrative has dominated textbooks, documentaries, and scientific consensus. But what if this cornerstone of human evolutionary theory is wrong?
When whole genome scans were done with modern humans, it turned out that there was one group of living humans that were related to the Denisovans, that had Denisovan DNA in them, and these people are down in Australasia. They're in New Guinea and Australia. So that's also very unexpected.
Recent discoveries are forcing scientists to reconsider everything we thought we knew about where we came from, and the implications are staggering.
Interesting aspects of this was a population that split off prior to Neanderthals splitting off from modern humans. So it's a fairly old population. And almost 11% of the ancestry of Africans comes from this ghost archaic population. So compared to the 2% or the 3% attributable to Neanderthals and Denisovans. So this had a fairly big impact in terms of how much ancestry comes from this population.
The out of Africa theory, what we've been taught. The story most of us learned goes something like this. Around 200,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans emerged in Africa. Then, roughly 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, a relatively small group of these humans left the continent and spread across the globe, eventually replacing all other hominin species they encountered. This became the dominant explanation for human origins, backed by fossil evidence, genetic studies, and archaeological findings that seem to fit together perfectly. The theory gained serious traction in the 1980s when genetic studies of mitochondrial DNA suggested all modern humans could trace their maternal lineage back to a single population in Africa. Scientists called this hypothetical ancestor mitochondrial Eve, though she wasn't actually a single woman, but rather represented a population. The fossil records seem to support this too. The oldest known Homo sapiens fossils were found in Africa, and early human remains discovered outside Africa appeared to be much younger. This neat timeline suggested a clear progression. Humans evolved in Africa, developed modern behaviors there, and then migrated outward in waves. Any hominin species found outside Africa, like Neanderthals in Europe or Homo erectus in Asia, were considered evolutionary dead ends. They might have coexisted with modern humans briefly, but they contributed nothing to our genetic makeup, or so we thought. The theory became so entrenched that questioning it was almost heretical in scientific circles. Textbooks presented it as established fact. Museums built exhibits around it. It became the foundation for understanding human evolution, migration patterns, and even the development of human culture and technology. But science has a way of upending even the most confident assumptions when new evidence emerges. Cracks in the foundation, early warning signs. The first hints that something didn't quite add up came from unexpected places. In the early 2000s, researchers started finding stone tools and other archaeological evidence outside Africa that were far older than the out-of-Africa timeline could accommodate. Sites in China and the Middle East contained sophisticated tools that predated the supposed migration by tens of thousands of years. Then there was the Neanderthal problem. For decades, Neanderthals were portrayed as our evolutionary cousins who went extinct without contributing to modern human genetics. But in 2010, scientists managed to sequence the Neanderthal genome, and the results shocked everyone. Modern humans of European and Asian descent carry about 2 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. This wasn't contamination or error. Humans and Neanderthals had interbred, and significantly so. This discovery alone didn't demolish out of Africa, but it complicated the narrative considerably. If humans mixed with Neanderthals, it meant the story of human evolution wasn't a simple replacement, but something messier and more interconnected. And if we got that wrong, what else might we have missed? Genetic studies started revealing other puzzles. Some populations showed unusual genetic signatures that didn't fit neatly into the African origin model. Aboriginal Australians and Papuans, for instance, had genetic variations that suggested either a much earlier migration than previously thought or multiple waves of migration with different source populations.
So they're in that position of being either a part of Homo sapiens but a very different part to anyone alive today, or, as I prefer to argue, they're a separate species, a separate evolutionary history.
The simple family tree was starting to look more like a tangled bush. Archaeological finds continued to pile up that pushed back dates and questioned assumptions. In Israel, fossils at sites like Kesem Cave showed human activity dating back 400,000 years, with evidence of sophisticated behaviors like controlled use of fire and systematic hunting. These weren't modern humans, but the timeline was getting crowded with different hominin species doing things we thought only modern humans could do. Perhaps most troubling for the traditional model were discoveries showing that modern human behavior, the things that supposedly made us special, appeared in different places at different times rather than originating in Africa and spreading outward. Advanced tools, symbolic art, and complex social behaviors popped up in Asia and Europe on timelines that didn't match a neat African exodus. The Grecopithecus bombshell. In 2017, researchers dropped a bombshell that struck at the very heart of human origins. They announced that Grecopithecus freibergi, a species known from fossils found in Greece and Bulgaria, might be the oldest known hominin, predating African finds by hundreds of thousands of years. The fossils were dated to 7.2 million years ago, right around the time the human lineage was thought to have split from chimpanzees. What made these fossils significant wasn't just their age, but their features. The researchers identified characteristics in the jaw and tooth roots that are typically associated with hominins rather than apes. If correct, this would mean the human lineage began in the Eastern Mediterranean, not Africa. The lead researchers suggested that environmental changes in North Africa, which turned the Sahara region into desert around that time, might have pushed early apes northward into Europe rather than southward into the African savanna. The timing also coincided with what's known as the Messinian salinity crisis, when the Mediterranean Sea partially dried up, creating land bridges between Africa and Europe. This geological event could have facilitated movement of early hominins between the continents, making Europe and Africa part of a connected evolutionary zone rather than separate theaters. Critics were quick to point out that isolated tooth and jaw fragments are notoriously difficult to classify definitively. Apes and early hominins share many features, and determining which side of the split a fossil belongs to based on fragmentary evidence is challenging. Many scientists argued that more complete fossils would be needed to overturn the African origin consensus. But the Grecopithecus findings did something important regardless of whether they're ultimately confirmed as the oldest hominin. They demonstrated that the Eastern Mediterranean region was home to apes and potential hominins at the critical time when our lineage emerged. This meant Africa wasn't the only possible cradle of humanity. The door was open to reconsider where our story really began. Asian origins, new fossil evidence. While Europe was delivering surprises, Asia was mounting its own challenge to African exclusivity. China, in particular, has produced a steady stream of hominin fossils that don't fit comfortably into the established narrative. Some of these finds are forcing scientists to reconsider not just where humans evolved, but how many times and through what processes. In central China, the Dali skull, discovered in 1978, but continuously studied and reanalyzed, shows a mixture of archaic and modern features dated to around 260,000 years ago. Similar transitional fossils from sites like Jinyushan suggest that hominins in Asia were developing modern characteristics on their own timeline, independent of African populations. These aren't quite Homo sapiens, but they're not entirely archaic either. The Shujiayao site in northern China yielded fossils dated to between 260,000 and 370,000 years ago, with surprisingly modern features. The skulls show brain sizes within the modern human range and cranial proportions that blur the line between archaic and modern humans. If populations in Asia were independently developing modern traits, it suggests parallel evolution rather than replacement from Africa. Even more intriguing are findings from Israel, which sits at the crossroads of Africa, Europe, and Asia. The Mislia cave jaw fragment, discovered in Israel and announced in 2018, dates to around 180,000 years ago. This makes it potentially the oldest Homo sapiens fossil found outside Africa. But the dating creates a problem. It's older than the supposed out-of-Africa migration by more than 100,000 years. The Mano cave in Israel added another piece to the puzzle with a skull dated to 55 years ago that shows both modern human and Neanderthal features. These Israeli sites suggest the region was a melting pot where different hominin populations met, mixed, and possibly evolved together rather than one group replacing another. Indonesia has contributed its own complications with the discovery of Homo floresiensis, the famous hobbit species that survived until as recently as 50,000 years ago on the island of Flores. While not directly related to the origin of Homo sapiens, its existence proves that multiple hominin species with complex evolutionary histories were scattered across Asia, making the region far more important to human evolution than previously recognized. Genetic complications. Nobody expected. When scientists began conducting large-scale genetic studies of modern populations worldwide, they expected to find evidence confirming the African origin story. Instead, they uncovered a genetic landscape far more complicated than anyone imagined. The simple narrative of a single population leaving Africa and spreading across the world couldn't explain what researchers were seeing in the DNA. Beyond the Neanderthal DNA found in non-African populations, scientists discovered something else: Denisovan DNA. Denisovans are a sister group to Neanderthals known primarily from genetic material rather than extensive fossils. Modern Melanesians, Aboriginal Australians, and some Asian populations carry up to 5% Denisovan DNA. This means our ancestors didn't just meet and mix with one other hominin group, but multiple groups across different regions. But the genetic surprises didn't stop there. Studies of African populations revealed that they too show signs of interbreeding with archaic hominins. These mystery populations, sometimes called ghost populations because we don't have fossils to identify them, contributed DNA to modern Africans just as Neanderthals and Denisovans contributed to non-Africans.
And these strange people called the Denisovans, now we only know about them because of DNA work that's gone on in this site of Denisova in Siberia. So this is a cave that's been known for a long time. There were some very fragmentary human fossils from there, a finger bone, a couple of teeth, a foot bone, and each of them has yielded significant DNA. And the surprise was that DNA was distinct. It wasn't clearly Neanderthal, it wasn't clearly modern human, it was something different.
This discovery demolished the idea that Africans represent a pure ancestral population while everyone else was mixed. Statistical analyses of genetic variation suggested that human populations were structured into multiple groups much earlier than the out-of-Africa model predicted. Rather than a single population expanding from one region, the data indicated that different populations existed in Africa, Europe, and Asia, with gene flow between them going back hundreds of thousands of years. We're not descended from one population that spread out, but from multiple interconnected populations that exchanged genes over vast time periods. Some geneticists now talk about Africa as more of a genetic hub rather than a point of origin. Gene flow went in multiple directions, with populations moving into and out of Africa repeatedly. The continent's role in human evolution remains crucial, but it's not the sole source from which all humans sprang. Recent studies have also identified genetic variants in modern humans that are so ancient they couldn't have arisen after the supposed out-of-Africa bottleneck. These variants exist at frequencies that only make sense if human populations were large and structured across multiple regions for much longer than the replacement model suggests. The math simply doesn't work for a recent, single origin. Perhaps most tellingly, different genetic markers, whether you look at mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosome data, or autosomal DNA, tell slightly different stories about human origins and migration. They agree on some basics, but differ on details in ways that suggest our history is more complex than any simple model can capture. The Jebel Irhoud problem. In 2017, the same year as the Great Epithecus announcement, another discovery shook the foundations of human origins. Researchers working at Jebel Irhoud in Morocco announced that fossils from the site, previously thought to be around 160,000 years old, were actually approximately 300,000 years old. This pushed back the origin of Homo sapiens by 100,000 years. On the surface, this seemed to support African origins. After all, these were Homo sapiens fossils found in Africa. But the discovery created as many problems as it solved. For one thing, Morocco is in North Africa, thousands of miles from East Africa, where the origin of our species was supposedly centered. If the oldest Homo sapiens were in North Africa, it suggested our species didn't originate in one location, but emerged across a much broader region. The Jebel Irhoud fossils also don't look quite like modern humans. They have modern-looking faces, but more archaic skull shapes. This mosaic of features suggests that what we call Homo sapiens didn't appear fully formed, but evolved gradually, with different modern features appearing at different times and possibly in different populations. The researchers themselves describe the implications carefully. Rather than modern humans originating at one time and place, they suggested our species emerged from interactions between different populations spread across Africa. This Pan-African origin is very different from the idea of a single ancestral population in one region. If Homo sapiens was forming through interactions of populations across all of Africa over hundreds of thousands of years, why couldn't the same process have included populations in nearby regions of Europe and Asia? The distinction between an African origin and a broader Afro-Eurasian origin starts to blur. Geographic boundaries that seem clear on a map meant little to populations that could and did move between continents. Denisovans and ghost populations. The story of Denisovans reads like scientific detective work based on fragments and shadows. In 2010, researchers analyzed DNA from a finger bone found in Denisova Cave in Siberia.
There was a finger bone in a cave in Siberia, southern Siberia on the border of Mongolia and Kazakhstan and Russia, that was marked as a modern human by the Russian archaeologists who excavated it. But in fact, when it was sequenced by this laboratory in Germany, it was found to be neither a Neanderthal nor a modern human, but something else entirely. It was a finger bone of a little girl. This is the size of it. And it was amazing that it was even identified as human. But once it was sequenced, it was clear it was like nothing that we had ever seen before.
The genetic sequence didn't match modern humans or Neanderthals. It was something else entirely, a previously unknown hominin group that we now call Denisovans. Since then, only a handful of Denisovan fossils have been identified, a few teeth, bone fragments, and a jawbone found in Tibet. Despite this scarcity of physical evidence, we know Denisovans contributed significantly to the genetics of modern humans in Southeast Asia, Oceania, and even, to a small extent, in mainland Asia and the Americas.
We found that the Denisovan individual matched New Guineans significantly more often than it did the Chinese. The interbreeding of Denisovans not only occurred with New Guineans, but with the ancestors of Aboriginal people from the Philippines and from Australia. And if you look in these black shaded circles in these pie charts, this is where the Denisovan ancestry is present today, highest frequency in the Philippines and in Australia and New Guinea, and also in people who have mixed with New Guinean populations as they spread out into the Pacific and into Indonesia.
What's remarkable is where Denisovans lived and when. Their range spanned from Siberia to Southeast Asia and the Tibetan Plateau, demonstrating that archaic hominins were widespread and adapted to diverse environments. The Tibetan jawbone, dated to at least 160,000 years ago, shows they were living at high altitude, suggesting sophisticated adaptations. Genetic studies reveal that there were actually multiple Denisovan populations, genetically distinct from each other. Modern humans encountered and interbred with these different Denisovan groups at different times and places. Some of the Denisovan DNA in modern Papua New Guineans comes from a group that split from Siberian Denisovans hundreds of thousands of years earlier. But Denisovans are just the beginning of the ghost population story. Genetic analyses keep finding signatures of interbreeding with hominin groups we can't identify. In 2019, researchers reported evidence that Denisovans themselves had interbred with a super-archaic hominin population that split from other humans nearly 2 million years ago. This mystery population might have been descended from a much earlier migration out of Africa, surviving in Asia for over 1 million years before encountering Denisovans. African populations also show genetic evidence of mixing with at least 2 different archaic hominin groups. These ghost populations diverge from modern human ancestors between 300,000 and 500,000 years ago. Yet they were still around recently enough to contribute DNA to people living today.
We call it a ghost population because this is not a population which we have identified based on any fossil evidence. And what we find is this model, which has a ghost introgressing into the African population, does explain this conditional site frequency spectrum.
Who were they? Without fossils, we can only guess. But their existence proves that human evolution in Africa was also a story of multiple populations interbreeding, not a single lineage leading to us. These discoveries paint a picture of the late Pleistocene world as home to numerous hominin populations, many more than we've found fossils of. Modern humans are the product of mixing between many of these groups, not the pure descendants of one ancestral population. Every major population in the world today carries genetic legacy from multiple archaic hominins, suggesting our family tree is less a tree and more a braided stream. What scientists are actually saying now. The scientific community hasn't abandoned African origins entirely, but the conversation has shifted dramatically. Most researchers now acknowledge that the classic out-of-Africa replacement model is too simple to explain the evidence. The question isn't whether it's wrong, but how wrong and what replaces it. Some scientists advocate for a modified version called assimilation or partial replacement.
The whole idea of Neanderthals as a different species is really a recognition of their separate evolutionary history. The fact that we can show that they evolved through time in a particular direction, distinct from modern humans, and they separated maybe 400,000 years ago from our lineage. So they're in that position of being either a part of Homo sapiens but a very different part to anyone alive today, or, as I prefer to argue, they're a separate species, a separate evolutionary history.
In this model, humans originated primarily in Africa but interbred with local populations as they spread, incorporating genetic material from Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other groups. Africa remains central, but the story includes more mixing than previously thought. Others have moved toward African multi-regionalism, proposing that Homo sapiens emerged from interactions among multiple populations across Africa, rather than a single population in one region. The Pan-African model explains the early dates and diverse features of fossils like those from Jebel Irhoud and other sites. Africa as a whole becomes the cradle of humanity, not just one corner of it. A smaller but growing number of researchers argue for something more radical, that modern humans emerged from a network of populations spanning Africa, Europe, and Asia with gene flow between them over hundreds of thousands of years. This Afro-Eurasian model treats the human range as an interconnected system rather than separate regions. Modern humans didn't originate in one place and spread. They coalesced from populations that were already widespread. The fossil evidence, these scientists argue, shows transitional forms appearing across multiple regions, not a sudden appearance of fully modern humans in Africa followed by migration. The genetic evidence shows deeply divided population structure and extensive interbreeding that only makes sense if populations were interacting across broad regions for a very long time. Debates at conferences and in journals can get heated. Researchers who spent careers building evidence for out of Africa don't easily accept that their life's work might need fundamental revision. Younger scientists, less invested in older models, are often more willing to consider alternative interpretations. What's clear is that the certainty of the 1990s and early 2000s is gone. Researchers now routinely acknowledge limitations of their models and the possibility that future discoveries will require further revision. The field of human origins, once thought to be approaching settled science, is in a state of productive chaos. Why this changes everything. If modern humans didn't originate in a single African population and spread outward, replacing everyone else, then we need to rethink fundamental assumptions about who we are and how we got here. The implications reach into biology, anthropology, medicine, and even our understanding of human nature. For one thing, it means human evolution was a network, not a tree.
What's clear from looking at genetic data, not just in Europe, but other places that we and others are beginning to get data from, is that people are the results of layers and layers and layers of mixture. That nobody's pure, and that in fact those ancestors were not pure either, that in fact people are just the results of mixtures and mixtures and mixtures, and the right way to look at this may not be that of a tree, but as a trellis, a kind of just layering and layering of mixing.
We're not descended from one ancestral group, but from many populations that mixed and exchanged genes over vast timescales. This makes the very question of where did humans originate somewhat meaningless. We originated everywhere that populations contributing to our ancestry lived, which might have included Africa, Europe, and Asia. The revision also affects how we think about human variation. If different populations contributed to modern humans in different regions, some of our genetic diversity might come from those ancient sources rather than arising after we became Homo sapiens. Features we think of as adaptations to local environments might actually be archaic inheritances from populations that had lived in those regions for hundreds of thousands of years. Medical research could be impacted too. Understanding the sources of human genetic variation matters for identifying disease genes and developing treatments. If our assumptions about human population history are wrong, it might affect how we interpret genetic data in medical studies. On a deeper level, it changes our relationship to other hominins. Neanderthals and Denisovans aren't evolutionary dead ends or distant cousins. They're part of us. Most people alive today carry their DNA. They're ancestors, not just relatives. The story of human evolution isn't one of superior modern humans replacing inferior archaic ones. It's a story of populations meeting, mixing, and ultimately merging into what we are today. This perspective makes human evolution more interesting, not less. Instead of a linear march from primitive to advanced, we see a complex web of interactions across continents over millions of years. We're the product of that complexity, carrying within us the genetic legacy of multiple hominin species and populations scattered across the old world. The debate over human origins isn't settled, and it won't be for a long time. Every new fossil discovery, every genetic study has the potential to reshape our understanding. What seemed like established fact just 20 years ago now looks questionable. The next 2 decades of research will likely bring surprises we can't even anticipate. But one thing is clear. The simple story of modern humans evolving in Africa and spreading across the world, replacing everyone else without mixing, is dead. What replaces it is still being written, but it's a far more intricate and fascinating story than we ever imagined.